With respect to climate refugees, or what I often call climate-induced migration, in the literature we refer to it as CIM, climate-induced migration. Climate-induced migration, or climate refugees, has been an issue for years. It goes back to the 1980s and the late 80s and into the early 1990s. A concern was increasingly expressed by observers, by analysts, by scholars about the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations. And it was a fairly robust literature that began to develop, again, about 20, 25 years ago. And the argument was pretty straightforward, and that was that anthropogenic climate change would cause people to move, millions of people to move, millions, hundreds of millions of people to move in the time to come, in the future to come. The scope of this change was somewhat vague. People, again, offered numbers, estimates. Again, 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, millions of people expected to move. One group said that it would be 1 billion people would move because of climate change in the decades to come. So the numbers were vague and imprecise. Additionally, the time horizon was also rather open. By 2020, by 2040, by 2050, by the end of the 21st century, and so on. People offered a wide range of estimates and time horizons. And it became rather quickly a fairly contentious literature. People arguing about the directionality of the migration, the complicated relationships between environmental issues and other factors that prompt migration. And it was, I think, amazing, rich, and frustrating literature in its own right. And again, I'm speaking about the late 80s and into the 1990s. People immediately, there's no doubt about it, people pointed out that this was nothing new, that throughout the millennia, people had moved because of environmental drivers. Even in the last century, people pointed to the Dust Bowl as an example of an environmental stress that caused migrations of people. But again, in the aftermath of the Cold War in the 1990s, this was a new emphasis on climate refugees, climate migration, climigration, some people called it, one word, climigration. They would mash the word together. And again, it was a very robust kind of debate. But something happened. Something happened very directly and very profoundly, I think, in the early part of the last decade. 2001, 2002, 2003, we saw a new emphasis with respect to climate-induced migration, and that is the idea that it was a security threat. The climate migration and the climate refugees themselves would become a security concern, and it became increasingly securitized. And securitize is an ugly word. It's bad English. It's just not very pleasing. But essentially what people were saying is they were injecting security imperatives. They were injecting security ideas, security notions into migration and climate-induced migration. They employed a threat defense logic, this idea that climate migrants would pose a threat and a concern. And like any IZE word, when you securitize something, like any IZE word, it had a kind of telos to it. It had a sort of an end state, a process to it. Democratize, industrialize, modernize, and so on. Any IZE word like that has this notion that this is a trend and a direction in this regard. And this was taken up again, 2001, 2002, 2003. It was taken up by security officials, and by security officials I mean defense ministries, intelligence think tanks, national security officials. And frankly, as you might imagine, this is not the type of folks who might be particularly concerned about climate change, about global warming. But climate change and its impact, in the view of this formation, was increasingly seen as a serious threat. And Michael spoke about this morning as a threat multiplier. The idea that it was a threat multiplier in its own right. Again, I think what's really crucial about this formation is that they weren't concerned about mitigation. They weren't talking about how do we mitigate greenhouse gases that cause climate change. They weren't that concerned about adaptation. They weren't talking about so much in terms of preparing people for the effects of climate change, trying to prepare vulnerable populations and adapt to the effects of climate change. But instead, they were preoccupied with climate change as a national security threat, as a security issue and a security concern. They were doing this, I think, in a whole bunch of ways in terms of thinking about preparing and the preparedness and impact on vulnerable governments, on governments that might be fragile or perhaps trending toward failure. Some of the security formations were concerned about shipping in the Arctic. As the Arctic ice melted, this would open up new shipping lanes and present security issues. They went so far as talked about inundation of coastlines and the impact on naval bases around the world. And then, of course, refugees, climate-induced migration, and the role that refugees might play. And this was what we began to increasingly see in the last decade was the idea that climate-induced migration would prompt a wave, a horde, a mass of refugees toward the North Atlantic. And again, I think they picked up some of the language that we saw in the earlier decade. And they argued that we, and by we, I mean, I think pronouns are so important, right? By we, they meant the North Atlantic. We have to prepare. We have to prepare and must anticipate and prepare for this threat. Now, I know in this kind of presentation, putting text up in slides can be kind of deadly, but I think the discourse and the language is really valuable. So I wanted to put some of these slides up to show you some of the language that was emerging in the early part of the last decade. This is 2003, the U.S. Department of Defense, the Office of Net Assessment put out a report, and it was a landmark report in that people both within the security community and then also people watching the security community said, this is big. This is how the Pentagon is thinking with respect to climate change, and climate change as a security threat, and in this, this passage as an example in terms of climate migration. And they wrote, with diverse growing climates, wealth, technology, and abundant resources, the U.S. could likely survive shortened growing cycles and harsh weather conditions without catastrophic losses. Borders will be strengthened around the country to hold back unwanted, starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands, an especially severe problem, Mexico and South America. So again, the language is very honest and very upfront. Unwanted, starving immigrants from the Caribbean islands and South America. A second example, I have 4 examples here, maybe 5, four or five examples to show you. Here's a second one. This is from the Center for New American Security, and actually I have a new report. No, I'm sorry, this is not from the Center for New American Security. This is from the Center for American Progress. But this is a Washington think tank, the Center for New American Security, and the CSIS is the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown. And they released a report that its title, I think, was really quite significant. They chose the title purposefully, Age of Consequences. That was the phrase that Churchill used, and I can't do a Churchillian imitation. But he spoke about how in World War II, we are living in an age of consequences, that we are confronting a new threat in the context of World War II. And so the folks who wrote this report in 2007 picked up that Churchillian discourse. And they wrote that perhaps the most worrisome problems associated with rising temperatures and sea levels are from large-scale migrations of people, both inside nations and across existing national borders. In all foreseeable scenarios, it was projected that rising sea levels in Central America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and the associated disappearance of low-lying coastal lands could conceivably lead to massive migrations, potentially involving hundreds of millions. These dramatic movements of people and the possible disruptions involved could easily trigger major security concerns and spike regional tensions. In some scenarios, the number of people forced to move in the coming decades could dwarf previous historical migrations. The more severe scenarios suggest the prospect of perhaps billions, plural, of people over the medium or longer term being forced to relocate. There's so much here. One of the things that is the first slide from the Age of Consequences. One of the things, the first half of it. One of the things that's interesting about these kinds of reports is that they were sophisticated. They were nuanced in terms of their approach to climate change science and climate science and earth science. So it wasn't they had done their homework with respect to these kinds of scientific concerns, and that's to their credit. But again, you see some of the, to my mind, absurdly vague numbers, the numerology that is used, the numeracy that is used in these kinds of discourses, I think in its own right is really intriguing. There's a volume that came out 2 years ago, edited by Peter Andreas and Kelly Greenhill, called, I didn't write it down. I didn't write down the title. Sex, Drugs, and Body Counts. That's Sex, Drugs, and Body Counts, and it's about the politics of numbers that are used in talking about trafficking or drug wars or refugees, and how so often, round numbers, large round numbers, are invoked as a way of trying to mobilize the listener, the reader of those kinds of numbers. So, and in the second part of this, quote, the more severe scenario suggests the prospect of perhaps billions of people over the billions. I mean, it's just a really remarkable kind of vagueness to it. So that's the second one, the age of consequences from the CNAS and CSIS group. To jump over to the other side of the pond, the UK, the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense, they misspelled defense to my eyes, but 2007, the UK Ministry of Defense, I think this quote is really quite telling. The emphases that are here, the italics, are in the original. I didn't put those in. And I'm not a grammarian, I'm not a word maven, but I'm struck with the way the tenses, and the tenses, I guess is what you would call it, the way they shift. They write here, a combination of resource pressure, climate change, and the pursuit of economic advantage may stimulate rapid large-scale shifts in population. In particular, sub-Saharan populations will be drawn towards the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Middle East, while in Southern Asia, coastal inundation, environmental pressure on land, and acute economic competition will affect large populations of Bangladesh and on the east coast of India. Similar effects may be felt in the major East Asian archipelagos, while low-lying islands may become uninhabitable. I really don't know why they would italicize their own prose that way, but again, it's just it's kind of a striking sort of indeterminacy or vagueness in their predictions and in their projections about the impact of climate change. Here's also still on the other side of the pond, this is the EU, the European Commission. This is a joint report that the EC did with Javier Solana, former commissioner, chief commissioner of the European Commission in 2008. And they wrote very directly that climate change is best viewed as a threat multiplier which exacerbates existing trends, tensions, and instability. The core challenge is that climate change threatens to overburden states and regions that are already fragile and conflict prone. It is important to recognize that the risks are not just of a humanitarian nature. It's really striking to me how they derogate humanitarian concerns as being not that important. It's not just of a humanitarian nature. They also include political and security risks that directly affect European interests. So it's about us, we in the North Atlantic, who are most, may be most affected by climate change. And they go on to write, those parts of the population that already suffer from poor health conditions, unemployment, or social exclusion are rendered more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, which can amplify or trigger migration within and between countries. The UN predicts that there will be millions of environmental migrants by 2020, with climate change as one of the major drivers of this phenomenon. And I think I have one more just to show you. Yeah, so again, that's the European Commission. And then to swing it back over to North Atlantic, to the United States, this is from the American Security Project. Vice Admiral Lee Gunn, U.S. Navy, retired U.S. Navy Admiral, Vice Admiral, writes, the consequences, this is 2009, the consequences of climate change will be found and are being found now around the world. New climate conditions will drive human beings to move in ever larger numbers, seeking food, water, shelter, and work. No region will be immune. Climate refugees will increasingly cross our own borders. The stress of changes in the environment will further weaken marginal states. Failing states will incubate extremism. All of this is just the foretaste of a bitter cup from which we can expect to drink should we fail to address urgently the threats posed by climate change to our national security, to us, to our national security. So this was the kind of discourse that I think that was emerging, not that I think, that we saw emerging in the last decade in the security community, in the intelligence community, folks sort of gaming out and trying to think about the future and the impact of the future on security issues. And this was, I think, one thing I want to point out before moving on is that in some ways, in the early 1990s, environmentalists were toying with, were sort of playing with the idea, to what extent do we want to securitize this issue? To what extent is it a security issue? Because if it's a security issue, that's a way of getting people to pay attention to it, right? That's a way of getting policymakers to say, oh, it's a security issue, and it rises to that concern. And so we often saw in the early 90s, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, this sort of question about, is the environment a security issue? And if we do call it a security issue, what are the pitfalls and consequences of it? So you saw that very much from the green, from the green perspective, and it was from the light green all the way over to the dark green kind of arguments. Here in this instance, we see people who aren't that green, but who are taking up that sort of argument that, that environmental issues and climate change is a security issue. And I want to return to that in a little bit in the kind of discussion in terms of the as we move on. I think one other thing I want to point out before moving on is that when you securitize something, when you sort of speak of something as a security threat, as a security concern, it's a speech act. It's an effort on the part of the speaker to try to convince an audience that there's something to be concerned about. You know, Dr. Strangelove, when the crazy general Dr. Strangelove was talking about how the commies are putting fluoride in the water, you know, and don't you see what's going on here? You know, they're trying to take control of our minds and our lives. He's using this kind of fear and this concern about saying, look, there's something out there, and you have to be concerned about it. And if you're not concerned about it, you're not paying attention, but let me help you understand what's going on. So I think there's this kind of you know, emphasis on the security as a on climate change as a security threat that we saw emerging here. And my overall point is that what's happening, I think, in a lot of ways, is that these arguments that are being used by defense and security officials are swinging back in to the environmental community, into the environmental left, into the green community, into, I'm not sure what the right label or language is, but I think people are increasingly saying, well, the Pentagon's taken this seriously, intelligence community's taken it seriously as a concern, climate refugees, therefore we must do it as well. And just last summer, just as an anecdote, last summer there was a climate teach-in that I went to in Northampton, where I live, Northampton, Massachusetts. And Northampton's a, you know, sort of a, you know, typical New England college town. And it was a climate teach-in that brought together a bunch of, you know, climate types, environmental activist types, and people were sort of giving very good presentations about climate change and its impact and efforts to deal with it. But time and time again, I heard people say, climate refugees is a concern. The military, the Pentagon's pointing to it as an issue. It's being increasingly invoked as this effort. And this is the kind of sort of, you know, discursive change that I'm you know, very much, you know, interested in and anxious about. What are the implications? Actually, before we go on, I want to show you some of the anxieties that we see in the media along these lines. This is a boat that was off the coast of Lampedusa, the Italian island that's between Italy and Tunisia. And I think what's interesting about these kinds of images is that this is undoubtedly happening. I mean, this is surely happening. It's a real concern. It's a real humanitarian crisis in many ways, where boats do try to come across the Mediterranean. Often as patrol boats approach them, people jump out of the boats and try to swim away. And there's a tragic loss of life, you know, in terms of trying to save folks, as they try to flee the Coast Guard or the patrol boats that approach them. But there are these, you know, images that you know, are in the media and come into the media quite dramatically. This is the Hunen, is part of the Carteret Atoll in Papua New Guinea, and an island that has been bisected by rising seawaters. That is often shown around as an example in the South Pacific. Somali refugees in Kenya, and you know, this is a flash flood circumstance that people are fleeing. And again, this is the kind of image that is often put forward when people say climate refugees, climate change, climate-induced migration, or climate change is inducing migration in the international arena. There's oodles of maps. I love maps. I'm particularly fond of maps. There's a striking number of maps that one finds in the media. This is the source of this is the United Nations and Frontex, which is the new 2005 agency of the European Union, which is actually based in Warsaw. But it's they put out these maps that show migrant routes from Africa that I think are striking in a lot of ways because of the red lines. This is the movement that's moving north toward the Canaries and then on to Ceuta and Melilla, and I'll come back to Ceuta and Melilla in a little bit, in northern Morocco, or trying to get across from Libya and Tunisia into southern Spain. This map itself appeared on the BBC website, so again for the European and North Atlantic viewer, this is again a very striking image. And what I want to do right now, too, is show you a 2-minute trailer from has anybody seen the documentary Climate Refugees by Michael Nash? It's worth seeing, but here's the trailer from it. I think I have it loaded.
Climate change is on a complete collision course right now with civilization as we know it.
We've had lots of civilizations collapse in the past from environmental causes.
I'm certain climate change has occurred.
Our responses at the moment are inadequate in terms of coping with these newly displaced people.
These are really the human faces of climate change.
Nature is now at war with us.
We're going to have to rethink climate change as being some remote environmental issue that the scientists will work out over there.
It's so huge. It's so big that's coming our way. It's almost beyond comprehension.
We are the same human race, no difference.
We're dealing with the fact that there's a gap between what the law provides and what the world needs. People cross borders all the time.
That will change all sorts of equations. When you get scarce resources, or if you get a change so radical that people can't function, you have huge displacement.
The threat of refugees as a consequence of climate change is an enormous national security issue.
Europe is spending millions to defend itself against immigration from Africa.
When the Pentagon begins to think about what might happen, that's a clear indication that we have to start taking something seriously.
This is not a 100-year or 50-year issue, it's a present issue. It already is affecting the price of food you're putting on the table. It will affect the price of energy that you pay for your home and your automobile.
We can meet this challenge. We can transition to a low-carbon economy.
We can invent our way out of this problem.
We ought to be able to come together, not red versus blue, but in a red, white, and blue way.
The challenge is no longer to save the planet. The challenge now is to save civilization itself. And that is not a spectator sport.
So this is it's the trailer, and it's an interesting trailer too in its own right. I mean, the way it's cut and put together from the film, because it goes about 2/3 in, and then it has the cue of the nice music that comes up and has a more optimistic vibe to it in terms about how we can fix this and deal with it. The first 2/3 are very much sort of this kind of view that obviously that refugees are a security concern, and it's interesting too because the film, I mean, I highly recommend it. It's very provocative. It's, again, 2010, Michael Nash. It's a mess in terms of its, treatment of the science, the climate science. But he had remarkable access to quite an array of interviewees. And that's to his credit. And I think his heart is in the right place, and as I'll try to argue. But I think, I'll jump to the screen grab. This is this kind of image that we see. It was part of the film. In fact, in the film, what they do is that this last image that we saw the movement of it in the trailer of kind of going up into Europe and then swinging across as the globe turned into North America. Earlier on in the film, it kind of starts in different parts of the world. So it's first from subcontinent India and Bangladesh. And so South Asia, there's a little bit in terms of Southeast Asia as well. There's an Africa animation. And then it comes around to that one we saw here very quickly in the film that culminates in it's coming here to North America, these red lines of people coming into North America. And again, it's just part of this, this new dynamic. I think also here's the Center for American Progress. This is a new report that just came out from the Center for American Progress about the Arab Spring and climate change. And it's, you know, it's laudable. I mean, I like it. I like the emphasis on trying to understand the environmental drivers of the Arab Spring, the 2011 and 2012 uprisings that continue into this year. It's a laudable effort to try to understand, you know, what they call agflation, you know, this process of agricultural rising prices around the world. And so they're trying to break apart some of the regional blinkers that we have when we talk about the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa, to talk about how it's connected into rising food prices in China and Russia and sub-Saharan Africa and so on. So I like that. At the same time, it does have this sort of sense about climate migration is, you know, sort of this big red arrow that's coming up into the north. So what are the implications? I guess, you know, what I've been trying to argue is that there's this view now that climate refugees are a security concern. It's been mediatized. It's in documentaries and in news analysis and, you know, sophisticated analyses by think tanks and so on. What do you do? What are the implications? If you think of climate refugees as a security threat, what are the next steps? Well, I think this is where it gets really concerning, are the implications. The first one is that you begin to cast refugees, migrants, people who are moving for a variety of reasons, for a whole complicated set of reasons because of the reasons people move. You begin to cast them as what? Threats, as concerns, as in some ways you end up victimizing them even further by treating them as the human face of climate change, as the phrase is often used. And I think increasingly we see climate refugees as being scapegoated as part of the climate change discourse and climate change analysis. The second thing I think, you know, increasingly what we see is this effort to securitize borders. And in so doing support transit states. Let me first show you some of the border efforts that are being increasingly developed. This one between India and Pakistan. There's also a similar one between India and Bangladesh. The one between India and Bangladesh in particular was begun in the early part of the last decade, 2000, 2001, 2002. Initially, it was not cast so much as because of environmental issues. It was more about political security or, you know, national security for India, and the concern of terrorism, and part of the I don't think the Indian officials so much were thinking in terms of global war on terrorism per se, but in time it morphed into that. And then by 2005, 2006, 2007, Bangladesh as being especially vulnerable to climate change, environmental refugees stemming from Bangladesh and its vulnerability coming into India was also invoked. To the east, I don't have an image of India, Bangladesh. U.S.-Mexico border, we're very familiar with this, and the double fences, and the motion detector sensors, the cameras that are along the border, the razor wire that are along the U.S., you know, large parts of the U.S.-Mexican border now. Again, this began before climate change became a deep, deep concern in the late 90s and into this last decade. You know, Operation Gatekeeper was begun by Clinton in 1994. So to say that fences are being built because of climate change, I'm not saying that, but I think part of the rationale for them is because of that. And then this is the Moroccan-Spanish border. Spain has two enclaves in northern Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla. Ceuta, as the Moroccans call this one, and, you know, the Spanish call it Ceuta. And again, you see the double razor wire between these enclaves and the Moroccan border. And just to show you a map of where this is located, Ceuta is right across from Algeciras in the Strait of Gibraltar. They're right to the east of Tangier, right northeast of Tangier, whereas Melilla is further east over here, closer to the Algerian border, and a further distance to get to Spain. But Ceuta, being right there, is much closer. So this is part of the the border control that is emphasized in the region. You have systems that have been constructed in the last decade to control the border, and this is part of CVE, the integrated system for the vigilance of the Strait of Gibraltar, that has now been extended, all the way to the west, down here to between the Canary Islands and Morocco and the Sahara. So what happens in this instance is that an object is classified as a threat. A boat is classified as a threat because it doesn't have a transponder on it. It's not licensed. And satellite picks it up, and then a patrol boat and a helicopter are dispatched to intercept the threat as it comes across. I mentioned Frontex with that map that I showed. This is a Frontex patrol boat in the Mediterranean that works very closely with NATO, I should add, with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and NATO, and it's in working the Mediterranean and Atlantic waters there. And then this is the new system that's being devised in the fences between Ceuta and Melilla and Morocco. And so they're expanding this and increasing the ability to keep migrants from coming across. So again, my overall point is that the implications of thinking in these terms is that there's an enhancement of border security and a rationale, an increasing rationale for border security. The second concern I have is that there's been an increasing support for transit states. Transit states are the states through which migrants travel. The degree to which they travel is, I'm going to come to that in a little bit. The volume of the travel, I think, is in itself a question. But let's go back to this map. When you look at Morocco, or an even better map would be this one. Morocco is a transit state. Algeria is a transit state. Tunisia, Libya was a transit state. I can go on and on and on about Libya. But one of the things that was really striking about Gaddafi being overthrown by NATO's bombardment in 2011 is that March 1st of 2011, he gave an interview to the BBC. And in the interview, Gaddafi was asked by the interviewer, kind of what gives, what's going on here, and how do you feel about this NATO-led effort to overthrow you? And Gaddafi said, Blair and England and Berlusconi and Italy, they have no morals. Right? It was like this bizarre through the looking glass kind of moment with Muammar Gaddafi accusing other people of having no morals. But it was this idea he was feeling betrayed because he had been doing what Berlusconi and the Italians and the EU had been wanting him to do for roughly 10 years, for nearly 10 years, in terms of interdicting migrants, keeping them from getting into Tunisia and getting across to Lampedusa and Italy. And so as this bombardment began, he felt betrayed, and he said so much. But transit states, had long been supported by the North Atlantic, by the EU, and Mexico is an example of a transit state. Turkey is often cast as a transit state. And so these are states that through which migrants travel in their efforts to get across. And so there's the support for transit state that I think is deeply concerning, because so many of these transit states are authoritarian, deeply undemocratic. To go to this one again, Morocco and Algeria in particular. Algeria is indefensible in terms of its authoritarianism. The army that's in power in Algiers, and Ben Ali, who was in power in Tunisia before his fall in 2011, they enjoyed close support from the North Atlantic because they were seen as transit states through which migrants will come. So I'm deeply concerned about treating transit states and supporting transit states as part of the rationale for climate change. The transit states themselves embrace this role. This is Moroccan King Mohammed VI. In September 2009, there was in Marrakesh, there was a meeting of demographers, and he gave a speech at this. He actually had a high minister give a speech on his behalf, but it was delivered, in his words. And he said, food security, desertification, farmland depletion, and sea level rise are pressing issues for demographers to ponder, so as to address their severe implications, particularly serious problem migration movements, a phenomenon that is set to take a more critical turn in the future. Located at a point where North meets South, Morocco feels very much concerned about migration issues. To face up to the impact of migration movements, we have been working with our Euro-Mediterranean partners on the strategies that need to be developed to bring this phenomenon under control. So it was right about this time, 2009, in fact, I think it was October 2009, that Morocco signed an interoperability agreement with NATO and now cooperates very closely with NATO on these kinds of issues. So the first one, again, the first point that I was making is that there's an emphasis on tightening border security. Well, actually, the first point was treating climate-induced migrants, climate refugees as the human face of migration, is risk scapegoating them. The second point I was trying to make is that there's this augmentation of border security. The third one is that you support transit states that do not merit support because of their authoritarian nature, and I think that has implications for democratic institutions in the North Atlantic itself. The fourth one is thinking of migration as, think of adaptation as survivalism. And I think this is a problem that we're confronting in adaptation literature. Adaptation itself sounds great, right? In terms of thinking about how do we adapt to climate change. It sounds kind of peaceable, appealing. Humans must work to adapt to climate change. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that. Thinking of adaptation as building resilience, coping with the impact of anthropogenic climate change, improving development performance of societies. This is what your point was earlier, Tark, in your presentation. Pursuing clean and just growth. Working on the provision of potable water, education of boys and more importantly girls, family planning programs, infrastructural improvements. These are the kinds of adaptation strategies that are inarguable in many ways. But I think when we think about climate change as posing a security threat, and when we securitize climate change, adaptation is cast as survivalism. It's kind of more of a survivalist mentality. There's a coming apocalypse, there's a coming horde, and we have to prepare for it. And so I think above all, this militarization of climate change and this sort of securitization of climate change is deeply problematic, and again is sort of causes me no end of consternation and something about which we might talk. But here's the thing. One of the deepest ironies or paradoxes of all this is that I think in many ways the fear and the anxiety is unwarranted with respect to climate-induced migration or with respect to climate refugees. I think there's a great deal of anxiety and concern about climate change, as we've talked about already this morning at some length. Climate change is really profoundly concerning. All the projections that one looks at in terms of the future trends. Even if you take the best case scenarios, they're still not very good, and the worst case scenarios are really quite alarming, to put it mildly. But I think there's a deep irony with respect to climate-induced migration and climate refugees, and that comes from insights that we gain from migration studies and climate studies themselves, and that is that the environmental stress on communities does not lead to profound, large-scale out migration. And this is something that again people have been working on for some years now. But looking at rising temperature, decreased rainfall and drought, natural disasters that are linked to climate change, like flash floods and so on, migration studies tell us that environmental stress and calamity actually impede people's ability to move. People tend not to move in the context of climate change or environmental stress and environmental movement. And this is something that I think is not played up or is not emphasized well in the alarmist literature. Again, whether it come from the green side or whether it come from the militarized side, people don't point to the fact that, for example, to migrate is expensive. Moving is expensive. It takes resources to migrate. And if their livelihoods are affected adversely or if they're impacted negatively by climate change, their ability to move great distances is actually undermined and undercut. They tend to stay put. And we've seen this in all kinds of studies with respect to drought and other kinds of environmental stresses or sudden calamities, catastrophes that take place. People tend to stay put. If you don't have the resources, you don't have the strength, you don't have the ability, the energy to move great distances. More along these lines, if you're impoverished, what does tend to happen is people tend to stay within regions. They tend to stay within country. They do tend to move toward urban centers. So urbanization is a real cause for concern and a real issue in looking at the impact of climate change on migration. But again, migration and environmental and demography studies from Africa, from South Asia, from Latin America have fairly conclusively made this point and looking at it and looking at this in this regard. And I think this is again it's somewhat counterintuitive and it's challenging for us to think, but it's this kind of argument that empirically people have looked at the idea that Scarcity in and of itself doesn't cause conflict. We have this assumption that scarcity will immediately prompt people to conflict with one another and launch into a violent violence with their counterparts. But in some ways, conflict tends to be more common in situations of relative abundance. And when there's scarcity, when there's a drought, when there's lack of water, when there's high temperatures, people end up tending to cooperate. And we've seen that again looking at studies, for example, of herders and pastoralists, where there's an increasing effort to cooperate in those situations rather than moving toward conflict. I think additionally, when we look at some of the geographical, some of the spatial issues associated with migration, and I'm especially interested, as you can tell, with Africa and the Sahelian region of Africa and on into the Maghreb, the North Africa. When we look at Africa, the scope of Africa is really quite astounding. And I think in the North Atlantic, and in terms of our own sort of map awareness, we're not very good on understanding these aspects of things. In part, it's because traditional projections, like the Mercator projection, shows the Greenland as being larger than Africa. Africa is just not captured in terms of its scope and size. But better projections, like the Mulvey projection, show the scope of Africa, the size of what we're talking about in terms of people's and the space across which people have to move. I love this map personally. Or not a map, but this illustration showing the scope of Africa, just how large it is, that you could put China, Western Europe, India, Argentina, and the United States into Africa, and there would still be a little bit of square kilometer space left over. We saw this a lot in this past January and February with the French intervention in Mali and sort of efforts to try to capture the size of Mali and Algeria as well as being, really significant in comparison to the size of the United States. So when we think about migration in Africa, it's a vast space across which people can travel. So I don't know if I can quickly go back. I can try and go back and give you guys a seizure with going through so many things. But just these kinds of red arrows are just sort of I don't know. I mean, people do make these treks, but to make these treks takes resources. And the number of people who do make these treks is significant. It's not insignificant. Thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people. In Morocco, for example, I'm most familiar with Morocco. In Morocco, we're talking in some of the cities, the major cities of Morocco, sub-Saharan African migrants on the order of 10, 12, 15,000. That's a significant number of people. And that's a real issue in terms of employment generation, real issue in terms of integration, real issue in terms of racism within Moroccan society, dealing with these newcomers. But it's not the hordes that I think we're being treated to in terms of a lot of the discourse that's being put out right here. I think there's also some additional issues that come with respect to climate change and climate change projections. For example, one of the ironies, one of the paradoxes of climate change moving forward, I'm not sure what the right word is here, that there are those who argue in terms of looking at projections that it's likely that the Sahel, this band of countries that go across Mali, Niger, Chad, Mauritania, Senegal, all the way over to Sudan, this band of countries may actually enjoy more rainfall as a result of climate change, looking out in the future decades in terms of decadal variability. They may enjoy more rainfall because of warming sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic, bringing in rainfall into that part of just the south of the Sahara. It's hard to know. I mean, again, these are projections, but you see these similar kind of projections about how there are parts of the northern Russia that might warm and might benefit from climate change. But again, I think it's kind of a perverse sort of way of thinking about climate change myself. But in terms of saying this characterization of Africa as burning up or becoming uninhabitable or being sort of a vast area, you see in the literature people talking about how in the future Africa will be uninhabitable. Africa will not be uninhabitable. There will be people there. People coping with climate stress and environmental stress, but it will not be uninhabitable. And again, in some parts of the continent, there will be some rainfall, as well as in East Africa, increase in rainfall. My overall point with respect to Africa and these, just to try to wrap this up, And when you look at the Sahel, what happens in the Sahel as people deal with fluctuations in rainfall and rising temperatures, they tend not to go north. I've been trying to make that argument. What they do is they go south. And again, I think this is the issue as we look forward in terms of adaptation and climate change and dealing with climate change as an issue. It's the increase of the population of cities along the Gulf of Guinea and the southern coast of Africa. As people move into the coastal cities, that's a profound issue. That's a profound development issue in terms of water provision, infrastructure provision for the folks who live there, and dealing with the urbanization and stress that comes from it as people move south, and not to the north. So those arrows that we see in the media as like zooming up toward Europe, I find them, again, as you can tell, quite frustrating. So in terms of moving toward a conclusion, and then opening up for conversation and argument perhaps as we move forward, what is the solution? How do we desecuritize the discourse? How do we put the genie back in the bottle, as I'd like to do with respect to climate change? And I'm not sure you can put the genie back in the bottle, but I do think it's important to be watchful of this kind of discourse. I think one of the first ways to do so is deal with the empirical irony that I've just been talking about. Sort of looking at the empirical evidence with respect to climate change and migration and push back. And so when Washington or Brussels or the security think tanks say climate change is going to cause massive waves or massive hordes of migrants, challenge that ideological assemblage. Push back at that security discourse and point out the empirical fallacies or the empirical questions that remain with respect to the impact of climate change on people's ability to move and migrate. Question, I think, not only sort of push back and point at the empirical issues, but question the organizational motives. What's at the heart of defense establishment and intelligence establishment as discursive agents trying to amp a fear, trying to heighten a fear, and stress this kind of discourse? They're trying to augment their military budgets. They may be trying to cow a citizenry. They're trying to provide a raison d'etre for their own existence. So what's at stake here with the military and intelligence and security establishment emphasizing these kinds of things? And I think further, examine the implications and press for the implications for democracy of fencing oneself in and supporting authoritarian transit states, authoritarian governments on the periphery of advanced industrialized countries, these militarized borders. Again, just to return to Mali and Algeria from this past January, and the French intervention this past January, or December and January, and still now that goes on. One of the arguments that people kept putting forward, by people I mean the establishment, put forward with steps forward was what? Work with the government in Algiers. Let's work with the government in Algiers, and indeed the French worked very closely with the government in Algiers, and the attack on the oil installation in Ain Amias. They worked very closely with this government in Algiers, as if the government in Algiers is this kind of just sort of friendly ally government. And in terms of the global war on terror, it is a friendly ally government to the North Atlantic powers, but it is a deeply militarized, deeply authoritarian government, deeply undemocratic. And so as we, in this instance I mean we as analysts, as we look at that kind of discourse of what's happening with supporting these kinds of governments, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now, when Algeria goes into turmoil, it's managed to avoid the turmoil thus far, but when it goes into turmoil, or when Rabat goes into turmoil, because it's managed to avoid it thus far, but who knows, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, then everyone will say, oh, how come we didn't see this coming? Well, for the longest time, the United States and Europe has been supporting very closely these regimes, and I think that's again, deeply concerning and deeply problematic. I also think we have to be careful about the catastrophist discourse, the catastrophist images, and the scholarship that is out there. And again, I think this is well-intentioned. It's laudable scholarship. It's people who are deeply impassioned and concerned about these issues. But you can see from some of these titles that the kind of language, Global Warming by Cleo Pascal. Again, it's a very good book. It's a very good read. How environmental, economic, and political crisis will redraw the world map. Very securitized take on climate change. Climate Conflict, How Global Warming Threatens Security and What to Do About It is a 2010 book by Jeffrey Mazzo. out of Routledge Press. Climate Wars by Gwynne Dyer. The Fight for Survival as the World Overheats. Again, this kind of catastrophist, apocalyptic vision of the future. The Future Faces of War. This is, the diagrams themselves, I think, are really quite provocative. Of a soldier, of a militarized soldier looking across the way at children. Where we are, we're somewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, perhaps, the Sahel. It's hard to know. It doesn't, and inside the book jacket, it doesn't say where it is. And I can send you these titles if you wish, to check them out. So again, just there's Pascal, Mazzo, Climate Conflict, Gwynne Dyer, Climate Wars, The Future Faces of War, Population and National Security by Jennifer Scuba. And this one is really intense. Howell Welzer, Climate Wars, what people will be killed for in the 21st century. I mean, it's this kind of, foreboding sort of vision of the future and climate wars and climate conflict. I think what's striking about these kinds of reads is that they're appealing in a way, right? They're kind of easy to grab. They're sort of, you can grok, you can get your brain around it. But I do think they have to be resisted and profoundly so. Why do I say that? And again, I want to wrap up. There are climate cranks. We've talked about the climate cranks already this morning. The climate deniers, the climate skeptics, the folks who sort of say climate change isn't happening. The Rush Limbaughs, the Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma, the Heartland Institute, media that deny that climate change is happening or they underplay it. Or they certainly don't acknowledge that if it is happening, it's anthropogenic, that it's an anthropogenic climate change. But my concern is that when they do come around and they admit that climate change is happening, even if they won't allow that it's anthropogenic, when they do come around and admit that climate change is happening, they're going to go to the security discourse. This is the kind of discourse that they'll embrace and push. And I think we see this increasingly in the United States, even in this past year, in the aftermath of Sandy. Zogby, for example, and other public opinion studies have shown that people are returning to the pre-fiscal crisis, the pre-2008 fiscal crisis take on concern about anthropogenic climate change. What we saw in 2007, after An Inconvenient Truth and the Nobel Prize being awarded to the IPCC. But I worry that, again, the Heartland Institute and Rush and Inhofe and so on will be susceptible to a security discourse that is mediatized and think in these terms. But finally, by way of conclusion, as Dr. Minch was arguing this morning, anthropogenic climate change is about justice. It's about human justice, and I think securitizing it is incompatible. It's incommensurable with climate justices. And I think what we need to do is push back against the security establishment's effort to treat it as a threat multiplier, as a security concern, as expanding security beyond the conventional old-fashioned notion of security. We need to stop vandalizing the word security and bringing it into energy security, and environmental security, and societal security, and economic security, and all these different kinds of securities. Let's keep it focused as a military thing, and then we can talk about whether climate change and anthropogenic climate change is a security concern, and I would say no. So I'll stop there and open up for questions and discussion.
We have the microphone here that you can use to raise questions. Also, let me remind you that in your programs, you have an evaluation sheet, and would you please complete that and turn it in at the door as you leave? So, where do we have questions?
I'll speak very loudly, so I'll keep it. I understand, Greg, entirely what you're saying about the warnings about migration linked to climate change being way overdetermined and problematic, especially in respect to securitization. But you, at the end of your presentation, you warn against the kinds of arguments being made by Welzer and what will be made by Christian Peretti this
Right.
afternoon and so on. And their arguments about future violent conflict in relationship to climate change is it doesn't hinge on migration. You know, there are many reasons, like Michael Clare's resource wars. So it seems that when you discuss migration the way we've over-determined its danger, that's extremely valuable for us. But then you make a larger claim far beyond the concerns about migration itself. Do you see what my question is? And I think there are reasons to worry about coming conflict related that are driven by or exasperated by climate change, you know, migration aside.
And do we want to take a couple questions first, or should I respond directly, or? Yeah. That's a very well taken point, and it's true. I mean, when people talk about it operates on a lot of different levels, right? There's a security. I didn't mean to pause for dramatic effect. That wasn't, but I'm trying to think it through. I mean, it's a really interesting question. It's true. It operates on a lot of different levels. There's a security establishment talking about these things, and then there's analysts, those of us who are analyzing the security establishment, talking about it. So there's that piece. I think additionally, you're absolutely right. There's the security establishment talking about the future impact of climate change, and one of the impacts that they're pointing to is climate refugees. And I take that. And again, I try to acknowledge that with saying that they're looking at other things too. They're concerned about shipping. They're concerned about, how to make governments more fragile. In this report that, by the Center for American Progress about Arab Spring and climate change, a climate and security correlation study, they're not just talking about migration within the Middle East and North Africa and refugees. It's true. It's true. I mean, they're definitely talking about different aspects of it. Its impact on agriculture. Its impact on all kinds of aspects of human lives. So yes. I mean, seriously. I mean, yes, it's true. But I do think that refugees are taking on a particular face of climate change, and they're being used and being deployed in really striking and interesting ways. Sometimes it's done in a very kind of caring fashion. This is the face of climate change, and we have to provide care. We have to provide humanitarian relief. We have to treat people who are victimized by climate change with compassion, and that's certainly appealing. But I do sense that especially some of the quotes from the Pentagon studies and the EU and so on, the European Commission, it's not done with compassion. They're not concerned about these folks as individuals, as threatened individuals, but as looming security threats. And I think that's what I find that people, that's what I worry that people will find especially appealing as we move forward with climate change politics.
Yeah, I strongly endorse that worry. Yeah. I share it. And of course, the poor and vulnerable always are scapegoated and bear the costs of our anxieties, etc. This is just one more way that is happening and will continue to happen. So,
yeah. I
mean, all that is well taken.
And Nash, for example, his to his credit, his documentary is not racialist. It's not racialized. The images that you see in the trailer and in the documentary itself are not kind of the poor are a threat to us and who we are, and so they're not scapegoated in that way, but there's a lot of them out there. He argues there's a lot of them out there, and they're coming our way, and I think that's what's troubling. Other questions or responses? Yes, please.
So I'm a student, right?
Uh-huh.
I don't know if I'm yet an analyst. I'm still learning a lot here. I'm trying to understand where you're going with your overall argument, right? Because to one extent there is climate change that is happening and needs to be dealt with, but what you're saying is that migration is happening, and yet climate change is not one of those major factors, or at least climate change shouldn't be used as an excuse to militarize regimes that would mistreat refugees. Is that where you're going with this?
It's the latter one. It's the latter one. That climate change shouldn't be used as an excuse to militarize, to securitize, to militarize politics. Both internal, domestic politics within advanced industrialized countries, as well as transit states or elsewhere around the world.
But you mentioned as well, though, within Africa, right? And just talking about the western part of Africa, when you look at the levels of rainfall and how that affects patterns of migration, we're not talking about issues that are national or simply domestic. They are transnational, and to an extent, I mean, if we're thinking still in those post-Westphalian, mindset, right? The state still has some. I mean, how is it that you would tell this to someone like Nigeria, who might be trying to protect its own border, when the problem is so transnational, it's so big, that they still have some short-term needs that they need to look into? And it doesn't have to be necessarily just in regards to, let's go ahead and give them weapons and, they cross the border, shoot them sort of thing. But it could be like, how can we set up tents? How can we get the United Nations and perhaps the richer countries to get involved here, put tents, take care of the refugees, right? Or perhaps look into ways for them to return back into their land. It looks like what you're saying, by reading your argument, if that's the case, you're saying, no. Climate change, they're not moving here for climate change. They're moving here for other reasons. It's for us to ignore it, and it's something that at least here in the West we don't care about. But those countries, no reason either. I don't know. I'm perhaps I'm misunderstanding.
No. I appreciate your question too, and I need to be clear about the argument that I'm making. I'm not saying that it's not a concern. I'm not saying it's not an issue in this sub-regional context at all. I think it's a deep issue. It's a profound concern about adaptation, dealing with the stress, the problems that arise when people move from Burkina Faso south, or from Benin, over to Ghana, when they're from northern parts of these countries as well, to the coastal regions. Huge, significant issues. Profound issues in terms of urban infrastructure and health issues and water issues and a whole array of dynamics. They have to be addressed, and that's what my concern is, that by thinking about climate change as a security issue, it's moving attention away from development efforts, from efforts to, that was a great response you gave about sustainable development. Trying to think of ways to, support efforts to adapt, to develop in a green fashion, to support governments that deal with migrants coming in from outside and peoples who are dealing with migrants coming in from other areas. I do think, so period, end of paragraph. I do need to emphasize that more. I'm not saying that it's not an issue in the sub-regional context, but I think in the North, when we focus on this as climate change as being a refugee concern to people, hordes coming north, then we lose sight of those issues, in the sub-Saharan context. You want to respond or expand, or?
Well, no, I kind of feel in sympathy with some of the sentiments behind what you're saying, but maybe also I'm not sure. Maybe there are areas of disagreement. One is that my own view is that even things like development and human rights are security issues, but that doesn't mean we deal with them in security terms. And I think where you and I agree is that if something is potentially a security issue, does not mean that it should be treated in the way we would normally treat with a security threat, through violence or the threat of violence. In other words, that happens only if we fail. The old saying that if nothing else turns up, clubs are trumps, right? So if nothing else happens, then you still have your club and you wield it. And so part of what we are trying to do in terms of both development, environment, many of these things, is to keep it away from the hands of the military. And certainly the analysis that I have seen, and I've looked at some of these literatures, because one of the pictures I showed was when we did the UN report on climate and security implications, which probably I find that 90% of it you will agree with. Although we use the term threat multiplier, borrowing it from the OECD.
Right.
But what we did was, the motivation for that was because some countries, the small island countries, essentially wanted to place this in the Security Council agenda.
Right, and that's what happened in 2007, and in 2008, yeah, right.
No, not 2007, it was 2009.
The Security Council took it up as an issue.
That the General Assembly took it up as I mean, the Security Council can't do it because it doesn't really have the votes. But when they wanted to do it, of course, the country later on, the United States supported it, but only for political reasons, not because they seriously believe that this is the case. But you see, our concern was that, yes, of course, it's a security issue, but it is a security issue which needs to be dealt with as a development or a humanitarian or extra problems, which is
it's exactly one of the questions. So why use? So I take your point. Why use the security word at all?
Well,
you know what I mean? Because I think security, as soon as you invoke security, even if you try to turn it into human security or environmental security or climate security, which is obviously more peaceable than military security and national security. But even when you use the security word, doesn't that sort of set alarm bells flashing and red lights going? And
not really, because those of us who have worked, and you've been an observer of this in the international system, do know, as I tried to say this morning, that everything is traced back from security, because international cooperation, building that international cooperation does have one common ground. But that doesn't mean that it has only one institution. After all, the Security Council deals with this particular issue, but we have a host of other agencies. Right. We do have WTO, we do have the International Monetary Fund, we do have our human rights commissions. We have a number of ways in which we are trying to make sure that we don't enter into a world where the security threats are so huge that they can be only handled through military means, as opposed to the way in which we are trying to. So it's a way of avoiding it becoming. Now, if I were to look at this, I would say, well, yes, maybe the movement is downwards, but it's not only Europe which is the problem. I mean, the other countries also may have problems.
Well, that's again the question. Yeah. So Nigeria or Ghana or.
And the second thing is that you see, today, the biggest sort of potential for migration does come from places where people are blocked, and a lot of the blockage is economic, and even sort of social/political, rather than environmental. Although the environmental is now increasingly becoming more
part of the story. Right.
Our concern is when the environmental becomes so huge that it will actually unleash an additional flow, not because people are traditionally moving in that direction, because they will get blocked for environmental reasons. And that's what we really need to think about, even if in the form of a counterfactual.
Even if in the form of what?
In the form of a counterfactual.
Counterfactual.
Right? I mean, just like, when you do a scenario and say, what if nuclear war happens? It's not because you want it to happen, but because you want to say, well, what if? I mean, how do we deal with things?
But I'm glad you said that too, because I think often, the counterfactuals or so the scenarios that are played out are taken as, the worst case scenarios are taken as assumptions of that's what's going to happen. So when the discourse, again, pre-securitization in the 90s, when the discourse was talking about, hundreds of millions, 200 million, 500 million, 1 billion people moving, it was sort of seen, well, that's what's going to happen. And then I think in turn, that leads people to think, well, how are you going to deal with that? The policymakers are responsible for protecting countries from invading hordes. They take that worst case scenario and sort of thinking about tomorrow, don't stop thinking about tomorrow, right? In terms of thinking about tomorrow, they say, well, that's the way it's going to be, and let's prepare for it. So it sort of brings to fruition, sort of fulfills that prophecy.
The menu of options is large, and I mean, I would, like you, probably want to veto some of the options,
right,
such as the one that you criticize. But I do know that there's a large menu, and these two options that people have put together does not exhaust the menu.
Oh yeah, so that's why
It's actually the start of a conversation.
And that's why we call for, paying attention to development and adaptation efforts, on the part. But I think that's what's being, my worry is that that's what's being squeezed out or pressed out. And I think the security language doesn't allow for that emphasis.
I don't know, maybe, because we did have these debates.
Yeah.
And many of the developing countries were very opposed to anything to do with
Security, right? Sure. I remember back in the 90s in particular. Yeah. And, okay.
But I mean, and my advice to them was that, look, what you have to say is very clear. That the reason why we are here is because we are concerned about peace. And that is why we have the Human Rights Commission, that is why we have WTO, that is why we have the IMF, that's why we have ECOSOC, that's why we have the Commission on Status of Women, ILO. All of these are there because we want to have peace. So everything is a security issue. But we don't want it to get to the point where the people in PCAPs and
right.
That's
it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Other questions or another one?
Have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
I was just curious. I spent some time in Italy, so I met a lot of people from...
Did you say Italy?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
So I met a lot of people from these different countries in Africa, and I was just wondering, like, what the ratio kind of is, or like, what's the bigger problem, whether it is the migration from the from the climate changes, or if it's also maybe more so religious, or not religious freedom. What's the word I'm looking for? Like governmental freedom, like being controlled by the government. Do you know what the ratio is, or like what may be like the bigger problem?
No, methodologically, I mean, it's a great question because methodologically it's hard to know. I mean, it takes. I mean, you could sort of imagine what it would take to know, but it's hard to actually do that kind of research and methodologically. You sort of need like a super anthropologist plus a demographer plus some kind of like superhuman researcher, team of researchers to figure it out. People who are in those circumstances, whether they're in Italy or Spain or France when they're interviewed, or whether they're in Tunis or Dakar or Rabat, trying to get across or thinking about getting across. When you ask them why are they moving, there's a whole range of issues. There's a whole basket of reasons that people move. It ranges from political freedom. My government's terrible. I need to leave. I'm looking for economic opportunity. Some interviewers, there was a really good study I read of people in Dakar, Senegal, trying to get up into Morocco and the Canaries, Canaries and hopefully into Spain. The Canaries are part of Spain. When they asked them, why are you moving? Does it involve climate stress, climate issues? They would say, oh yeah, my father's farm in Mali or my father's farm in Niger, we've had trouble with these past couple of years with crops. And so when the interviewers, when the researchers injected environmental causes as environmental issues as one of the potential causes, people said, yeah, we've had trouble with crops. So then the question, the challenge was it just being not fed to them, but was it just being suggested to them? Was it the power of suggestion as the reason? And then the debate begins about methodology. But yeah, people move for a whole array of reasons. Also, additionally, along those lines, people move within household strategies. So there are really complicated strategies that households make where somebody, the family decides, this sibling will migrate or this parent will migrate, this rest of the family will stay behind. And there's the complex flows of remittances of, the exchange of money from people earning money in Italy and sending it back home to the country of origin. So again, a whole bunch of reasons that people come across. After 2011, after Ben Ali fell and then the NATO bombing began in Libya, people who got up in Italy, some of them were fleeing those conflicts, no doubt. What was interesting, again, in terms of the European media and the way it was mediatized and crafted was that it was just part of this view of North Africa and the Maghreb and further south as being this zone of insecurity. It's an unstable zone, and people are coming, and we've got to fortify and stop them from further coming north. But that whole sort of what causes the causality piece is it's multi-causal for sure. So
Greg,
thank you all.
very much.
Yeah, thank you.